Imagine you're looking out of a window on a really bleak November afternoon, right? You see a torrential downpour. You can observe the rain hitting the glass. You see puddles forming.
You can tell the weather is absolutely miserable.
Exactly. But simply by looking at the rain, you have absolutely zero idea what the atmospheric pressure is doing over the Atlantic. You don't know the temperature of the air masses colliding miles above your head.
And you certainly can't calculate whether this storm is going to clear in an hour or, last for an entire week.
Right, which is a profound limitation if your actual job is to stop the flood.
Precisely. Because if you're just describing the visible water, you are always reacting. You're never predicting.
And frankly, that is the exact predicament of modern psychiatry. I mean, for decades, the diagnostic landscape has been heavily reliant on just looking out of the window.
We observe the visible weather patterns of a patient's distress, don't we? The disrupted sleep, the flattened effect, the hallucinations.
Yeah, and we categorize those symptoms, which is obviously vital, but historically we've really lacked the tools to map the invisible atmospheric pressures that actually generate the storm.
But that is changing. The field is currently undergoing an immense paradigm shift. What we are exploring today in this deep dive is the equivalent of building a complex mathematical meteorological model for the human mind.
Which is just staggering to think about.
It really is. We're taking thousands of unseen, invisible variables, neural firing rates, synaptic pruning, prediction errors, and we're translating them into rigorous mathematical algorithms.
We are making the invisible mechanisms explicit. We're shifting from merely describing subjective suffering to actually understanding the mechanistic computational processes that generate that experience.
Spot on. And for those of you listening, whether you're a psychiatry registrar, a seasoned clinician, or just a deeply curious learner, we are using a very specific foundation for this exploration.
Yeah, we're unpacking the core concepts from Chapter 1.24 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. And we should probably establish our anchor right away.
Yes, it's essential to explicitly frame our anchor for this conversation, just as the text does. Psychiatry fundamentally is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact, and how that process can go wrong.
How it can go wrong, right?
Exactly. If we're going to introduce computational models to this field, they must serve that specific definition. They can't just be abstract mathematics.
They have to bridge the biology of the brain, the psychology of the mind, and the actual reality of the patient's experience. Bridging that gap is the central mission here.
Absolutely. We're treating this discussion as a companion synthesis to the chapter. We're not just going to read you a list of facts or recite a table of contents. We want to build robust mental models.
So let's start with the historical context. Why do we even need mathematical models? I mean, why isn't the traditional approach enough?
Well, to answer that, we really have to look at the limitations of strict categorical behavioral diagnoses. Think of the traditional approach encapsulated by the DSM.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Right. Now, the DSM is a masterpiece of clinical consensus, but it is fundamentally a descriptive, checklist-based system.
So if a patient presents to the clinic, the psychiatrist looks for a specific threshold, 5 out of 9 criteria for a set duration, and they get the label of major depressive disorder.
It treats psychiatric illness almost like a binary state. You either cross the threshold into the category or you do not.
And while that reliability is clinically useful for, communication and billing, it masks an incredible underlying biological heterogeneity.
Precisely. 2 patients can meet the criteria for major depressive disorder without sharing a single overlapping symptom.
Yeah, one might be suffering from severe insomnia, profound weight loss, and psychomotor agitation,
while the other might be sleeping 14 hours a day, gaining weight rapidly, and experiencing extreme psychomotor retardation.
They have the exact same categorical label, but biologically, their nervous systems are likely doing entirely different things.
Which is exactly why the field is moving towards frameworks like the RDOC, the Research Domain Criteria. This approach abandons the rigid top-down categories.
Instead, it looks at dimensional disruptions in complex behaviors, right?
Yes. It suggests we shouldn't just study depression broadly. We should study the neural circuits responsible for reward processing or threat detection or cognitive control.
And crucially, we must map those disruptions directly onto well-defined neural substrates.
Exactly. The underlying premise, which is the absolute bedrock of computational psychiatry, is that the brain is a massively complex, nonlinear computational device. Mental illness is, at its core, a disruption in how that device processes information.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because I can hear the immediate visceral pushback from clinicians and patients alike.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
If we sit here and declare the brain is a computer and mental illness is a computational error, doesn't that strip away the profound humanity of psychiatric care?
It's a common fear, yes.
If I am a patient who has suffered horrific childhood abuse, or systemic poverty, or a devastating bereavement, hearing that my trauma is being reduced to a nonlinear computational error feels incredibly reductionist. Doesn't this mathematical framework just ignore the reality of human experience?
It is a vital challenge, and it's a misconception that we must dismantle immediately. Computational psychiatry is categorically not reductionist. It does not ignore the external world. In fact, it requires it.
Because you can't have computation without input.
Precisely. So the trauma, the bereavement, the social isolation, those are the inputs. They are massive, system-altering perturbations.
Right. External factors ultimately impact a physical organ.
They literally, physically remodel the central nervous system. Stress alters the transcription of genes. Trauma changes the density of dendritic spines.
So the goal of a computational model isn't to dismiss your trauma as mere math.
No, not at all. The goal is to mechanistically understand how your specific biological hardware processes that trauma.
I see. So it's not saying the grief isn't real. It's asking, how does the physical organ translate the experience of grief into the physiological state of despair?
Exactly. Whether the upstream cause is a genetic vulnerability inherited at birth or a severe environmental stressor experienced in adulthood, the psychiatrist is ultimately attempting to treat the central nervous system's response to those factors.
The computation is the manifestation of the experience.
Dot on.
But the scale of what you were describing is just staggering, connecting a traumatic life event to the firing of a single neuron that feels like an impossibly vast distance to cross.
It is. It's formally referred to in the literature as the explanatory gap, and it is arguably the single greatest intellectual challenge in modern medicine.
The explanatory gap.
Think about the hierarchy of the central nervous system. At the very foundation, you have the microscopic biophysical level. We are talking about individual synapses, the release of specific neurotransmitters, the gating of ion channels across cell membranes.
The raw, wet biology.
Yes. Then you move up a level of complexity. Those individual neurons form local microcircuits. Moving up again, those microcircuits form large-scale neural systems.
Entire cortical regions communicating across massive white matter tracts.
And finally, at the very peak of this hierarchy, you have complex, nuanced human behavior, decision-making, and subjective conscious distress.
So the explanatory gap is the void between knowing that a patient has an anomaly in a specific serotonin receptor and understanding why that specific anomaly causes them to believe they are worthless.
Yes. How do you draw a mathematical line from a molecule to a mood? Historically, we couldn't.
But computational psychiatry exists specifically to build bridges across that gap.
Exactly. We use mathematics to formalize the links between these distinct levels of the hierarchy.
But surely no single mathematical equation can span from an ion channel to a complex delusion. I mean, the math would be infinitely complex, the computers would crash.
You're absolutely right. You cannot use one master equation. Instead, the field uses three distinct frameworks of computational modeling.
Each framework is tailored to a different level of the hierarchy.
Precisely. You wouldn't use a highly abstracted economic model to understand the physics of a car engine, and you wouldn't use the equations of thermodynamics to predict the stock market.
You match the tool to the level of inquiry.
Exactly. And the textbook outlines these three approaches beautifully. Let's begin at the very foundation of the hierarchy, the cellular level.
The source text refers to these as biophysically based circuit model.
Yes, biophysically based. So these models are anchored entirely in the messy reality of neurobiology, strictly bound by it.
So they don't abstract things away into theoretical concepts.
Not at all. If a real human neuron has a specific type of calcium ion channel that opens at a precise electrical voltage, the computational model includes a complex differential equation that mathematically simulates that exact opening and closing in real time.
Wow. So these are hardcore bottom-up simulations of physical brain tissue. If you're building a model that granular, what kind of psychiatric questions are you actually able to answer?
Well, to understand their clinical utility, we need to focus on a specific, measurable cognitive mechanism. Let's look at working memory.
Working memory. Now, this isn't long-term memory like remembering your 10th birthday. This is the scratch pad of the brain.
Correct. Working memory is the ability to internally maintain and manipulate information in the immediate absence of sensory input.
It relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex, doesn't it?
It does. If I verbally give you a 6-digit verification code and you have to hold it in your mind for the 10 seconds it takes to type it into your phone, that is working memory.
You're no longer hearing my voice, but the information is still actively alive in your neural circuitry.
Exactly. So how does a biophysically based model represent that scratch pad? It mathematically describes working memory as an attractor state within a neural network.
An attractor state. That is quite a heavy physics term. Let's make sure we can visualize this for you listening because it's a brilliant concept.
It really helps ground the math.
Imagine a physical landscape, right?
Right.
A terrain with a series of deep valleys. Now imagine you are holding a ball. If you place that ball on the edge of a steep hill, gravity is going to pull it down. It will roll until it settles at the very bottom of one of those valleys.
Yes, and once the ball is resting at the bottom of the valley, it is in a highly stable state. That specific valley is the attractor.
Right. And the beauty of the valley is that it resists interference. If a strong gust of wind blows across the landscape and pushes the ball slightly up the side of the hill, what happens?
Gravity just pulls it right back down to the center. It corrects itself.
Exactly. In this analogy, the ball settling into the valley is your brain locking onto that 6-digit verification code.
It's a superb visualization. The stability of the attractor state, the depth of the valley, is what allows you to remember the verification code even if a car honks outside or someone drops a book next to you.
The external noise tries to push the memory out of the valley, but the network pulls it back. It resists distraction.
Precisely. But if you are a computational psychiatrist, you can't just be satisfied with a metaphor about hills and valleys. You have to translate that gravity into actual neurobiology.
So what physically creates a valley in the prefrontal cortex?
The floor of the valley, the gravity that holds the information in place, is generated by strong, recurrent, excitatory connections between neurons.
Essentially, a specific assembly of pyramidal neurons that code for that verification code begin to fire.
Right. And as they fire, they stimulate each other in a continuous reverberating loop.
Neurons that fire together wire together. Good old Hebbian learning.
Yes, but the timing is critical here. This recurrent excitation is primarily mediated by N-methyl-D-aspartate receptors, and NMDARs.
Why does this specific receptor matter? I mean, why NMDA and not, say, AMPA receptors, which are also excitatory?
Because of the temporal dynamics. AMPA receptors are incredibly fast. They open, flood the cell with ions, and shut off in a matter of milliseconds.
So if your working memory relied solely on AMPA receptors, the memory trace would be too jittery. It would flicker out almost instantly.
Like trying to keep a heavy flywheel spinning by just tapping it with your finger once a minute. It loses momentum.
That makes sense. So NMDARs are different.
NMDARs, on the other hand, are slow. When they open, they allow a lingering, sustained influx of calcium currents. They provide temporal stability.
Mathematically, in our biophysical model, the decay constant of the NMDA receptor is what dictates the depth of our valley.
Exactly. The slow currents keep the excitation smooth and continuous over several seconds, bridging the gap between inputs.
Okay, so the NMDA receptors dig the deep floor of the valley. But if these neurons are just constantly exciting each other, creating this reverberating loop, why doesn't that excitation spread?
Right, because the brain is densely interconnected.
Exactly. Why doesn't thinking of a verification code trigger a cascade of excitation that turns into a massive seizure?
That is the other half of the biophysical equation. You need walls to contain the valley. While the NMDA receptors provide the recurrent excitation, you also have a dense network of GABAergic inhibitory interneurons.
GABA being the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. The brakes.
Yes. These inhibitory cells provide a mechanism called lateral inhibition. As the pyramidal neurons representing the memory fire, they don't just excite each other, they also send signals to the surrounding GABA interneurons.
And then those interneurons actively suppress the firing of all the surrounding cortical tissue that is not part of the memory trace.
So the GABA interneurons act like the steep, slippery walls of the valley.
They carve out the boundaries, they ensure that the ball cannot roll over the hill into an adjacent valley, they keep the memory highly selective, sharp, and precise.
Precisely. A biophysically based model uses massive sets of differential equations to continuously calculate this exact balance of NMDA-mediated excitation and GABA-mediated inhibition.
It formalizes the EI balance, the excitation-inhibition balance.
And because it is grounded in real biology, we can use the model for predictive pharmacology. If we want to know what a novel drug that slightly blocks NMDA channels will do to a patient's working memory, we don't have to guess.
We alter the conductance parameter in the math, and the model shows us exactly how the valley deforms. That is an astonishing level of precision.
It is true.
But it also highlights an immediate problem. I mean, if you were tracking the voltage of individual calcium channels using differential equations, the computational load must be astronomical.
You could perhaps model a tiny sliver of the prefrontal cortex, but you could never model the entire brain that way.
Like you cannot. The biophysical models are vital for understanding local microcircuits, but they hit a computational wall when we try to scale up.
Which is why the field developed the second framework of modeling. We move from the cellular level up to the systems level.
The source material refers to these as connectionist or parallel distributed processing models, PDP models.
So, if we are moving to the systems level, we have to leave the strict biology behind. We are no longer tracking individual ion channels.
Correct. We abstract away from the messy biological realism. We stop calculating exact millivolt changes. Instead, we try to capture what we call brain-style computations.
Brain-style computations. Walk me through how a connectionist model actually works. What does it look like on a computer?
Well, a PDP model consists of abstract units or nodes. You can think of them as artificial neurons, but in reality, a single node might represent the collective activity of thousands of actual neurons.
And these nodes are arranged in distinct layers, right?
Yes, you typically have an input layer that receives information from the environment, an output layer that dictates a response, and critically hidden layers sandwiched in between.
Hidden layers. This terminology sounds identical to how computer scientists describe modern artificial intelligence machine learning, deep neural networks.
It is identical because they share the exact same historical and mathematical architecture.
The nodes in these layers communicate via weighted connections. A node in a hidden layer receives signals from the input layer, sums them up using a mathematical transfer function, and then decides how strongly to pass the signal forward to the next layer.
But the power of these models isn't just that they pass signals, it's that they can be trained.
Yes. The most crucial mechanism studied in PDP models is how an abstracted system actually learns a complex behavior over time.
We focus heavily on a mechanism called learning via error, and the workhorse algorithm for this in connectionist models is called backpropagation.
Backpropagation. Let's really break this down because it is the engine of learning in these systems. How does a network of artificial nodes learn to do something complex, like recognize a human face or understand a spoken word?
Let's use language as the example. Imagine we have a pristine, untrained network. We want it to learn to recognize a spoken word.
Okay, so an auditory sound wave hits the input layer.
Right. The signal propagates forward through the hidden layers, being multiplied by random connection weights until it reaches the output layer. The network makes a guess. It outputs the result. The word is cat.
But the audio file you played actually said bad.
Exactly. The network's output is incorrect. It failed. But that failure is the key to learning. The system calculates an error signal.
Mathematically, it looks at the difference between its actual output, cat, and the desired target, bat.
It quantifies how wrong it was.
And here's the computational magic. It takes that mathematical error signal and propagates it backwards through the entire network.
It traces the pathways back through the hidden layers, essentially telling every single connection, you contributed a specific percentage to this error, we need to adjust your weight.
So as a specific connection strongly voted for cat, the backpropagation algorithm weakens that connection's weight. It penalizes it.
Yes, it incrementally tweaks thousands of weights simultaneously. This process is mathematically known as gradient descent.
Gradient descent. I've always pictured that like standing on top of a jagged mountain and thick fog.
That's a great way to look at it.
You want to get to the bottom of the valley representing zero error, but you can't see the bottom. So you feel the ground around your feet, find the direction that slopes downward the steepest, and take one small step in that direction. You recalculate, find the steepest slope again, and take another step.
That is a perfect analogy. The algorithm is blindly stepping down the multidimensional error curve. After thousands of repetitions, thousands of tiny steps down the mountain, the network's weights are perfectly tuned.
So the next time it hears that audio file, it confidently outputs bat. It is learned via error.
That is elegant, and it clearly works for AI. And I have to ask, if we're talking about human psychiatry, why are we using abstracted models that don't even use real biological neurons?
That's a very fair point.
I mean, backpropagation is a mathematical trick. Brains don't literally send error signals backwards through axons in the same way a computer does. Why not just stick to the biophysical models?
It comes back to the explanatory gap. The reality is, for highly complex psychological phenomena like processing language, exerting top-down cognitive control, or the generalization of traumatic fear, we simply do not possess the precise synaptic maps.
The biology is currently too vast and unmapped.
Exactly. If we waited until we mapped every single ion channel involved in understanding a sentence, we'd be paralyzed. We'd never make any clinical progress.
So connectionist models allow us to build mathematically rigorous, testable hypotheses about how large neural systems behave without being held hostage by the unknown microscopic details.
They bridge the gap from the systems level to complex behavior.
Which perfectly transitions us to the highest level of abstraction in our framework. We've done cellular, we've done systems, now we reach the cognitive level, mathematical models of behavior.
At this level, we're formalizing the abstract algorithms underlying human decision-making and psychological computation. We aren't modeling neurons, and we aren't even modeling hidden layers of nodes.
We are modeling the pure algorithmic logic of the mind.
The source material highlights 3 vital mechanisms within these behavioral models. Let's start with the first one. Temporal difference reinforcement learning, or TDRL.
TDRL is the mathematical framework for understanding how an organism learns the value of its actions over time.
Why does an animal learn to press a lever for food, but avoid a lever that delivers a shock? Why do you learn to avoid touching a hot stove, but return to a bakery that sells excellent pastries?
Through trial and error, obviously. But how does the brain mathematically update its future behavior based on the past event?
It relies on a foundational concept called the reward prediction error, or RPE.
The RPE. If there is one concept from this entire deep dive that you listening should commit to memory, it might be this one. Once you understand the reward prediction error, you start seeing it in your own daily behavior constantly.
It is ubiquitous. The RPE is, very simply, the mathematical difference between the reward you expected to receive from an action and the reward you actually experienced.
Okay, let's ground this in a real-world scenario. Let's say I'm walking to work, and I decide to try a new, unpretentious-looking coffee shop on the corner.
Okay.
My internal expectation, my predicted value, is that this coffee is going to be incredibly average, a 5 out of 10.
So your baseline prediction is established.
I buy the coffee, take a sip, and it is a revelation. It is the best coffee I have ever tasted, a 10 out of 10. The actual reward vastly exceeded my predicted reward.
In that exact moment, your internal algorithm generates a massive positive reward prediction error. The outcome was highly unexpected in a good way.
That positive RPE is not just a feeling of pleasant surprise, is it? It is a mathematical teaching signal.
Exactly. It physically tells your internal algorithm.
Update the ledger, increase the value parameter of the action, go to this coffee shop.
So the next day, my predicted value is higher. I expect it to be an 8 out of 10. I drink it, it's still a 10. There's still a positive RPE, but it's smaller this time. Yes. The teaching signal is getting smaller because you are learning. Fast forward 2 weeks. You go to the shop every day. Your predicted value is now 10 out of 10. You expect perfection.
You take a sip, and it is a 10 out of 10. What is the RPE?
Expected 10, got 10. 10 minus 10 is 0. The RPE is 0.
And because the RPE is 0, the algorithm generates no teaching signal. You learn nothing new.
Yeah.
Your prediction was already perfectly calibrated to reality.
Your behavior has stabilized into a predictable routine.
And conversely, if I go in one day, expect a 10, but the barista burns the milk and it tastes terrible.
The actual reward is lower than the predicted reward. You generate a negative RPE. The algorithm issues a penalty signal. Decrease the value of this action.
It is such a clean, logical way to explain behavior. But what is truly mind-blowing is that this isn't just an abstract theory developed by economists or computer scientists.
No, it is physically embedded in the brain. Neuroscientists discovered that specific populations of dopamine neurons, particularly those projecting from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA fire, in a pattern that perfectly mirrors the TDRL equations.
Really?
Yes. When a monkey receives an unexpected juice reward, those dopamine neurons exhibit a massive burst of firing, a positive RPE. When the monkey is trained to expect the juice and receives it exactly as predicted, the neurons do not fire above baseline. The RPE is 0.
The mathematics predicted the biology. It is one of the greatest triumphs of computational neuroscience. But TDRL models how we learn value over days or weeks. What about split-second decisions?
Okay.
Like, what if I am not learning the value of coffee, but I need to make an immediate forced choice right now based on confusing information?
For immediate perceptual decision-making, we use the second behavioral framework, the drift diffusion model, or DDM. This models the cognitive struggle of two alternative forced choice tasks.
Let's visualize a two-alternative forced choice task. Imagine you are driving on a motorway at night. Suddenly, a thick, blinding fog rolls in. Up ahead, you see two blurry red lights.
You have to make a forced choice. Are those the taillights of a car moving in the same direction as you? Or are they the headlights of a car driving the wrong way, straight towards you?
A high-stakes, forced choice between two alternatives. Now, the DDM posits that your brain does not instantly possess the answer. You don't just look at the fog and instantly know.
Instead, your mind functions as a statistical accumulator. It gathers noisy evidence over time, millisecond by millisecond.
How does the model visualize that accumulation?
Imagine a graph. In the center is a starting point representing zero evidence. At the top of the graph is a strict boundary line representing the decision. It's a car driving away. At the bottom is another boundary line. It's a car driving towards me.
As you stare through the windshield, your visual cortex feeds noisy data to the decision circuits. The lights look a bit wider. That's evidence for towards me.
But wait, they seem a bit dimmer? That's evidence for away from me.
Precisely. If we plot this accumulating evidence on the graph, the line drifts up a bit, then sharply down a bit, bouncing around randomly because the sensory input is degraded by the fog. It is a biased random walk.
But if the car is, in reality, driving away from you, the underlying geometry of the lights will eventually provide slightly more data for that conclusion.
Yes. Despite the chaotic bouncing, the average trajectory of that line, what we mathematically call the mean drift rate, will slowly angle upwards toward the top boundary.
The exact millisecond that wandering line crosses the upper threshold, the accumulation stops. The decision is executed. You step on the accelerator because you believe it is safe.
So the DDM gives us a mathematical way to dissect how a patient makes choices. It isolates specific parameters. The drift rate represents how efficiently their brain processes the sensory evidence.
And the decision boundaries represent how much evidence they demand before they are willing to pull the trigger.
This is clinically profound. If a patient has severe ADHD or high impulsivity, the model might reveal that their drift rate is normal, but their decision boundaries are set abnormally close together.
They require very little evidence to act, resulting in fast but highly error-prone decisions.
They jump to a conclusion before the random walk has time to find the true signal. That brings us to the third and final behavioral mechanism, Bayesian inference.
This deals with something even deeper than choices. It deals with the mathematical formulation of belief.
Bayesian inference is a paradigm-shifting way to understand human cognition. It dictates that your brain is not a passive camera, just recording objective reality.
The brain is an active prediction engine. It is trapped inside the dark, silent vault of the skull, trying to guess what is happening outside. To do this, it constantly combines two mathematical probabilities.
The first probability is the prior.
Yes. The prior is your internal expectation. It is your deeply held belief about how the world usually works based on past experience.
And the second probability is the likelihood.
The likelihood is the actual incoming sensory observation you're experiencing in the present moment.
Yeah.
Bayesian math dictates that the brain multiplies the prior by the likelihood to generate a final, updated belief, which we call the posterior.
The posterior is what you actually experience as reality. Let's use an example that touches on human paranoia.
Sure.
Let's say I am walking down a dark, isolated alleyway at 2 in the morning in a dangerous part of the city. My internal expectation is highly primed for danger. I expect a threat.
Your prior probability for I am going to be attacked is mathematically very high in this context.
Suddenly, I hear a sharp sound behind me. A twig snapping. That auditory input is my likelihood.
Now, the sensory data of a twig snapping is objectively quite ambiguous. It could be a stray cat, it could be the wind, or it could be a mugger.
But your brain doesn't treat the sound objectively. It performs Bayesian inference. It combines the ambiguous likelihood, the snap, with your overwhelmingly strong prior this alley is dangerous.
And the resulting posterior belief is absolute terror. My brain constructs the reality, I am being followed, I am in danger. I turn around ready to fight or flee.
Exactly. Even if it was just a cat, your Bayesian math performed flawlessly. From an evolutionary standpoint, waiting a dangerous foal, prior heavily over ambiguous sensory data, keeps you alive.
It is better to be startled by a cat than to ignore a predator. Your belief wasn't based solely on what you heard. It was a mathematical negotiation between what you heard and what you already expected.
This is a breathtaking framework. We have the biophysical attractor valleys relying on NMDA and GABA. We have the connectionist PDP models learning via backpropagation. And we have these behavioral algorithms, TDRL, drift diffusion, and Bayesian inference.
But this is the crucial pivot of our discussion. How do these flawless algorithms break? How do we transition from understanding these mechanisms to explaining the devastating manifestations of psychiatric illness?
This is where computational psychiatry proves its clinical worth. Let's examine one of the most complex, challenging syndromes in medicine, schizophrenia and psychosis.
We can look at this single disorder through all three of our computational lenses and see how distinct symptoms emerge from different levels of systemic failure.
Let's start at the foundational cellular level, the biophysical manifestation. We talked about working memory being a ball in a valley, an attractor state maintained by the floor of NMDA excitation and the steep walls of GABA inhibition.
What does that mathematical landscape look like in a patient with schizophrenia?
Extensive post-mortem anatomical studies and genetic analyses have shown that schizophrenia is fundamentally characterized by a disrupted excitation-inhibition balance in the cortex.
The most consistent finding is a deficit in a specific type of fast-spiking inhibitory interneuron.
The GABAergic cells, the walls of our valley.
Exactly. The feedback inhibition is significantly weakened. So let's run the biophysical simulation. If you have a mild disinhibition, if those GABA walls are mathematically lowered, what happens to the shape of the valley?
It becomes shallow, it widens out, it looks less like a steep gorge and more like a gentle rolling basin.
Computationally, when the valley widens, the working memory representation broadens, it loses its precision, it becomes fuzzy and vulnerable to interference.
The patient struggles to hold a clear, precise thought in their mind because the neural activity is constantly leaking into adjacent, irrelevant representations. The ball keeps rolling around the wide basin.
This perfectly explains the hallmark cognitive disorganization we see in the clinic.
What happens if the pathology is more severe? What if the GABAergic inhibition is so compromised that the walls completely collapse?
If the disinhibition is strong enough, the baseline resting state of the entire cortical network destabilizes. The mathematical landscape becomes chaotic.
The differential equations show us that the network activity, the ball, can spontaneously jump into an attractor state even when there is zero external sensory input driving it.
It falls into a valley that shouldn't be there.
Yes. The brain spontaneously generates a working memory pattern out of thin air. The patient subjectively experiences a thought, a sensation, or a memory that feels incredibly vivid and real.
But it was generated entirely internally by a runaway disinhibited microcircuit.
That is a direct biophysical explanation for an internal hallucination. But schizophrenia is also deeply tied to dopamine dysregulation, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. How does dopamine alter the valley?
In hyperdopaminergic states, which involve excessive signaling via D1 receptors, the biophysical models demonstrate that the attractor states become rigidly inflexible. The dopamine effectively deepens the valley into an inescapable well.
So once a thought gets in, it cannot get out.
The network gets locked into one state. It requires a massive amount of external stimulus to push the ball out of that deep well and transition to a new piece of information. The mind loses its cognitive flexibility, getting stuck in perseverative loops.
The mechanics of the tragedy are laid bare. Let's move up to the systems level. How do connectionist PDP models explain the profound, complex symptom of auditory hallucinations? Hearing fully formed voices that do not exist.
For this, researchers utilize PDP architectures, specifically designed to model language. A prominent example is the Elman network, a type of recurrent neural network that is excellent at processing sequences over time, like speech.
Because language has context. The word you hear right now only makes sense based on the word you heard 2 seconds ago.
Exactly. So researchers train a healthy Elman network to accurately perceive and output words. Then, they attempt to computationally simulate a major prevailing theory of schizophrenia, the neurodevelopmental hypothesis.
This hypothesis suggests that during late adolescence, the brain undergoes a period of natural synaptic pruning to increase efficiency.
But in schizophrenia, this pruning process goes into overdrive. It becomes pathological. It aggressively eliminates far too many synaptic connections.
The brain is cutting too many wires in the communication network. How do you simulate that in the model?
You literally go into the math of the hidden layers and systematically delete connection weights. You set them to 0.
And what happens to the network's ability to process language?
The results are fascinating. Initially, a small amount of pruning actually makes the network slightly faster, mimicking normal adolescent development.
But as the simulated pruning becomes aggressive and crosses a threshold, the network suffers a catastrophic functional collapse.
The damaged architecture forces the hidden layers to spin into chaotic, reverberating loops. The network begins to repeatedly settle into abnormal, entirely internally generated states of activation. The researchers gave these states a very evocative computational term: parasitic foci.
Parasitic foci, a cluster of runaway activation feeding on the network. What does a parasitic focus mean in terms of output?
Mathematically, a parasitic focus is a pattern of activation across the output layer that screams, "I am hearing a specific word," even when the auditory input layer is receiving absolute silence.
The network is confidently hallucinating speech.
Yes. Because the internal structure is so heavily damaged by the aggressive pruning, the hidden layers misfire and trigger the output layer for language. The system tricks itself into mathematically believing a voice is spoken.
It is a profound systemic proof of concept for how a physical neurodevelopmental loss of synapses creates the terrifying subjective experience of hearing a voice.
It removes the mysticism from the symptom. The hardware is damaged, so the software generates phantom inputs.
Let's elevate this to the highest level. We've covered hallucinations. Let's tackle delusions. A delusion is a fixed, false belief that is resistant to reason. How do we explain that using the behavioral model of Bayesian inference? How does the math of belief go wrong?
Let's return to our Bayesian equation. Belief, the posterior, is a combination of your expectation, the prior, and your observation, the likelihood. In a healthy, rational mind, if you hold a strong prior belief but you are suddenly presented with overwhelming, contradictory likelihood evidence, your brain mathematically updates. You change your mind.
Right. I strongly believe it is raining because it's April. That's my prior. But I step outside, I look at the sky, the sun is shining, and I am totally dry. The likelihood evidence is irrefutable. My brain updates the posterior. I was wrong. It's not raining.
But in psychosis, the Bayesian updating mechanism is severely corrupted. And computational models suggest this corruption often originates from a phenomenon called aberrant salience.
Aberrant salience. Salience meaning importance or relevance.
Exactly. The brain uses dopamine, specifically in regions like the striatum, as a highlighter pen. Dopamine signals tell the brain, pay attention to this. This is important for your survival.
But in psychosis, the dopamine system fires spontaneously and chaotically. It highlights completely random, mundane stimuli.
It applies the fluorescent highlighter to the wrong words on the page.
Yes. So imagine a patient is walking down the street. A completely ordinary man in a blue jacket walks past them. Suddenly, their striatum misfires and releases a massive surge of dopamine.
The brain is flooded with a chemical signal screaming, "This man in the blue jacket is incredibly important."
But logically, he isn't. He's just a guy.
The conscious mind cannot tolerate that paradox. It has to make sense of the intense biological signal. So the brain fabricates a narrative to justify the salience.
It constructs an abnormally strong, mathematically rigid prior belief to explain the feeling. The delusion forms. That man in the blue jacket is a government agent assigned to follow me.
The biological error forces the creation of a paranoid prior. But why can't you just talk them out of it? Why are delusions fixed?
Because the Bayesian math is broken. That paranoid prior becomes mathematically overweight in the equation. It dominates the calculation.
No matter how much contradictory likelihood evidence you present, you could show them the man's ID, prove he works at a bakery, show them security footage, their brain physically cannot update the posterior belief.
The Bayesian equation places almost zero weight on the sensory evidence and 100% weight on the internal delusion.
It is a statistical updating software with a corrupted weight parameter. Framing it that way completely changes how you view a patient in the clinic. They aren't being stubborn, they aren't ignoring you, their brain is trapped in a broken algorithm.
Exactly. And we see this hijacking of parameters in other devastating disorders as well. Let's apply our behavioral models to addiction. Specifically, let's look at the temporal difference reinforcement learning model, the TDRL.
We discussed TDRL earlier, learning value via the reward prediction error, the RPE. We talked about finding a great cup of coffee, generating a positive RPE, and learning to go back. Eventually, the RPE drops to zero once the coffee is perfectly predicted.
How does a chemical substance like cocaine or heroin hijack that elegant system?
Drugs of abuse bypass the normal sensory pathways of reward. They act directly on the neurochemistry of the brain. They cause massive artificial phasic firing of the dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area.
They flood the engine room with the chemical that signals the RPE.
Precisely. But they don't just signal a normal reward. The pharmacological action of the drug forces the dopamine neurons to fire at maximum capacity, entirely independently of expectation.
Right, walk me through that. What does that mean for the math?
Remember the coffee. Once you expect it to be a 10 out of 10, and it is a 10 out of 10, the RPE drops to 0. Your brain says, I understand this value perfectly. Stop learning.
Right, the value plateaus.
But when a person injects heroin, the drug pharmacologically forces a massive dopamine spike. Even if the person has taken the drug 1,000 times and expects the exact high they're going to get, the chemical forces a massive positive RPE every single time.
Oh, wow. So the algorithm is tricked into believing that the outcome was astonishingly better than expected every single time they use the drug.
Yes. Mathematically, the algorithm adds massive value to the action of seeking the drug on every single iteration. Because the RPE never drops to 0, the calculated value of the drug never plateaus.
In the equations of the TDRL model, the value of the drug-seeking action literally approaches infinity.
The math breaks. It concludes the drug is more valuable than food, water, or human connection.
And when a value approaches infinity, it overrides the brain's highly evolved, flexible, model-based learning systems, the systems that allow you to weigh long-term consequences and make rational choices. It crushes those systems.
It forces the brain down into a rigid, primitive, model-free habit loop.
The behavior becomes entirely automatic.
The person isn't repeatedly choosing the drug because they want it in a conscious cognitive sense. In many cases, they desperately want to stop. But their internal biological algorithm has mathematically concluded that the drug is the single most important action in the universe, and it executes the habit relentlessly.
It removes the moral judgment from addiction and places it squarely where it belongs, as a computational failure of the survival learning algorithm.
That is deeply tragic, but it provides such profound clarity. What about trauma? How do these models explain the lasting scars of something like PTSD?
For fear conditioning, PTSD, and severe anxiety disorders, we often shift back to the systems level, the connectionist PDP models, and we apply them specifically to the circuitry of the amygdala, which is the brain's core processor for threat detection.
So we build an artificial neural network that simulates the inputs and outputs of the amygdala.
Yes. Consider a classic fear conditioning paradigm. A patient experiences a severe trauma, let's say a roadside explosion in a combat zone. The explosion involved a loud, specific auditory input. This is the conditioned stimulus. It also involves intense, painful, nociceptive input, the unconditioned stimulus.
The PDP model maps how the hidden layers in the amygdala physically strengthen their connection weights when the sound and the pain arrive simultaneously.
The network perfectly learns the association. The heavyweights dictate that the specific sound of an explosion guarantees pain. So hearing that sound again instantly triggers an output of intense physiological fear. That is adaptive, and that keeps the soldier alive in the war zone.
But PTSD isn't just reacting to the sound of an explosion. It is a pathological overreaction to safe environments.
Exactly, and we can model that. If the network connections in the amygdala become hypersensitized, perhaps due to chronic stress hormones, or if the top-down inhibitory control from the prefrontal cortex is weakened, the network dynamics change.
The model demonstrates a computational phenomenon called the generalization of threat.
What does that look like in the hidden layers?
The boundaries of the auditory trigger expand. The network starts firing the massive fear output, not just for the specific sound of an explosion, but for any loud, sudden noise. The weeds have become too easily activated.
So a car backfiring on a suburban street triggers the exact same cascading network failure as an improvised explosive device.
The PDP models allow us to simulate these targeted circuit-level disruptions. We can computationally lesion the prefrontal cortex's inputs to the amygdala in the model and watch in real time as normal, adaptive fear learning spirals outwards into pathological generalized anxiety.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of theoretical ground. The biophysics, the systems, the cognitive math. But if I am a listener, I want to know where this actually touches the clinic. This brings us to integration and clinical reasoning. How does a psychiatrist use these equations to actually help the patient sitting in front of them?
The ultimate goal of this field is moving toward true precision psychiatry. And the first major clinical step is using these models to discover and validate neurophysiologic biomarkers. We cannot measure a patient's hidden layers or their abstract RPE directly. We need a physical signal in a living human brain that corresponds to these computational failures.
Give me an example of a biomarker that bridges the math to the clinic.
Let's return to our very first biophysical model, the excitation-inhibition balance in the cortex, the interplay between the excitatory pyramidal cells and those fast-spiking, parvalbumin-expressing GABAergic interneurons. When that microcircuit is healthy and balanced, they fire in a rhythmic, synchronized feedback loop.
They oscillate together.
They do. And that microscopic oscillation generates a massive, synchronized electromagnetic wave across the surface of the cortex. Ways that we can easily measure non-invasively using an EEG or a MEG scan. Specifically, we measure this as gamma oscillations.
Gamma waves. These are fast brain waves, typically between 30 to 80 hertz.
Yes, high-frequency gamma oscillations are considered a macro-level signature of a healthy micro-level EI balance. They are crucial for binding information together during complex cognition. Now remember our computational model of schizophrenia. We demonstrated that the core deficit was a failure of those specific GABA interneurons.
The walls of the valley fell down.
Because those interneurons are damaged, the synchronized feedback loop fails. The microcircuit cannot maintain the rhythm. As a direct result, the macro-level gamma oscillation is destroyed. The EEG trace becomes disordered.
So the computational model provides the translation matrix. If a clinician sees a blunted, weakened gamma oscillation on a patient's EEG during a working memory task, they aren't just seeing a weird brainwave.
The math tells them with high probability that there is a profound deficit in GABAergic lateral inhibition at the synaptic level.
Exactly. It allows the clinician to read the biological tea leaves. But we can take this even further. What if we want to look at the entire brain, not just local circuits?
That brings us to resting state fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Yes. Researchers can take those detailed local biophysical models and network thousands of them together. They then combine this massive simulation with diffusion tractography. Tractography is an imaging technique that maps the actual physical white matter highways, the cabling inside a specific patient's brain.
So you aren't just running a generic brain simulation. You build a custom mathematical model that mirrors the unique anatomical architecture of the patient sitting in the scanner.
A digital twin of their connectome. And what these large-scale models demonstrate is fascinating. A local EI imbalance, a broken microcircuit in one small region of the prefrontal cortex, does not stay local. The chaotic firing ripples outwards along those white matter highways.
It acts like a virus in a computer network, causing brain-wide disconnectivity.
The entire system starts desynchronizing.
And we can see that desynchronization in the chaotic bold-E signals of the resting state fMRI. The computational model allows us to run the tape backwards, to trace the large-scale chaos seen on the scan back to the specific focal synaptic misfiring that initiated the cascade.
Which highlights exactly why the current DSM diagnostic criteria are so fundamentally inadequate for the future of treatment.
How so?
Well, we discussed this earlier. If you have two patients with major depressive disorder, the DSM groups them together based on subjective symptom clusters. But their underlying fMRI connectivity, their EI balances, their gamma oscillations, they might be completely antithetical to one another.
You are entirely correct. The DSM relies on group averages. The solution offered by computational psychiatry is a concept called computational phenotyping.
Computational phenotyping, let's unpack that. It sounds like precision medicine on steroids.
Instead of asking, does this patient meet the subjective criteria for diagnostic category A or category B, we look at their individual algorithms. We sit the patient down and have them perform a rigorous computerized cognitive task. Let's say a decision-making task involving reward and probability.
And as they make hundreds of choices on the screen, gathering noisy evidence.
We take their raw behavioral data and we fit a computational model to it. We might use the drift diffusion model or the reinforcement learning equations. We calculate the exact mathematical parameters for that single individual.
So instead of giving them a label of depressed, we generate a mathematical fingerprint. We say, this specific patient has a severely blunted reward prediction error, a highly erratic drift rate, and an overweighted negative prior.
Exactly. You pinpoint the exact algorithm that is failing. And that is the absolute foundation of true precision psychiatry. You treat the broken parameter, you do not treat the broad category.
Which brings us to the final, most hopeful frontier. How do we treat the parameter? If we know exactly what is broken in the math, how does this help us with translational targets and modeling treatments? How do we fix the brain?
Historically, developing new psychiatric medications has been a nightmare of trial and error. It is slow, incredibly expensive, and frequently ends in failure. But computational psychiatry offers a radical new approach. We can combine our models with massive genetic databases, what we call transcriptomic maps.
Like the Allen Human Brain Atlas.
The Allen Brain Atlas is a monumental achievement. It has mapped the expression of thousands of genes across the entire human brain. It tells us, with high precision, exactly where specific neurotransmitter receptor subunits are physically located.
It provides the exact GPS coordinates for the hardware.
Yes. So we take that genetic map and we overlay it onto our massive computational models. Now imagine a pharmaceutical company develops a novel chemical compound. They know it binds specifically to a very rare subunit of a serotonin receptor.
In the old days, they would have to give it to animal models, then run a massive human trial, and just cross their fingers and observe the behavioral weather, hoping it helps depression without causing catastrophic side effects.
But now, we don't have to guess. We locate that specific serotonin receptor subunit on the Allen Brain Atlas, we go into our computational model, and we mathematically alter the biophysical parameters at those exact locations to simulate the drug binding.
You simulate the drug in the math before it ever touches a human being.
We run the simulation, we watch how the drug alters the local EI balances, we watch how that ripples across the white matter, we observe how it changes the drift rate of decision-making or the strength of a working memory attractor state.
We can rationally, predictably guide pharmacological development based on mathematics rather than blind empiricism.
That is nothing short of phenomenal.
We have covered an immense landscape today, building a bridge from the microscopic conductance of a single NMDA receptor all the way to the rigid mathematics of a paranoid delusion.
We have. And if we synthesize the core takeaways from the source chapter, the narrative is clear. First, computational psychiatry is the translation of unseen, assumed brain processes, belief formation, prediction, reinforcement learning, into rigorous, testable mathematical models.
We examined 3 primary levels of inquiry. We explored biophysical models grounded in the reality of synapses, highlighting the vital balance of NMDA-mediated excitation and GABAergic inhibition in sustaining the attractor states of working memory.
We moved to connectionist PDP models, capturing the abstract dynamics of complex networks, demonstrating how neurodevelopmental synaptic pruning can collapse into parasitic foci and generate hallucinations.
And we unpacked behavioral and cognitive models, revealing the algorithms of the mind. The temporal difference reinforcement learning that calculates value via the RPE, the drift diffusion model that accumulates noisy evidence for choices, and the Bayesian inference that mathematically constructs our reality by weighing priors against likelihoods.
Ultimately, the most crucial takeaway is that devastating psychiatric disorders, whether it is the mathematically hijacked habit loop of severe addiction or the unshakable overweighted priors of psychosis, are not mere abstract miseries. They are specific, quantifiable disruptions in biological computation.
These models do not replace the art of clinical psychiatry. They provide the missing mechanistic language to explain why the patient is suffering. They offer the blueprint to the storm.
And to cement these complex mental models, we will now test your clinical reasoning with a series of single best answer questions drawn from the concepts we've explored.
Listeners, just pause the audio after each question to formulate your answer, and consider referring back to the textbook chapter for deeper review.
Question 1. In the context of computational models applied to addiction, which specific mathematical signal is artificially and repeatedly hijacked by drugs of abuse, leading to a massive inflation in the calculated value of drug-seeking actions? Take a second to think.
Right. The answer is the reward prediction error, or RPE, which is physically signaled by phasic bursts of dopamine projecting from the ventral tegmental area.
Brilliant. Question 2. When examining biophysically based attractor network models of working memory, what specific type of receptor is responsible for providing the slow, lingering, recurrent excitation necessary to stabilize the memory trace and dig the value over time? Give it a thought.
And the answer is N-methyl-D aspartate receptors, or NMDRs.
Spot on. Question 3. According to parallel distributed processing, or PDP models of schizophrenia, excessive elimination of connections simulating aggressive neurodevelopmental synaptic pruning in a speech perception network leads to the network collapsing into abnormal, internally generated states of activation. What is the specific computational term given to these hallucination-generating states? Pause here to answer.
The answer is parasitic foci.
Quite right. Question 4. A patient in the clinic exhibits a profound paranoid delusion that is completely resistant to overwhelming contradictory evidence. Under a Bayesian inference model of cognition, this fixed symptom is best conceptualized as a fundamental disruption in which specific aspect of probability. Take a moment.
The answer is an abnormally strong, rigid prior belief, which is often driven by aberrant salience and dopamine dysfunction.
Yes. Question 5. Which of the three computational modeling approaches we discussed specifically utilizes abstract algorithms, such as backpropagation and gradient descent, to modify connection weights and learn via error, without strictly committing to precise ion channel level neurobiology? Pause to consider your answer.
The answer is connectionist models, also known as parallel distributed processing or PDP models.
And our final question, question 6. A researcher is using the drift diffusion model, the DDM, to analyze severe decision-making deficits in a clinical population with high impulsivity. If the population exhibits a strong propensity toward rapidly selecting an option, regardless of the incoming sensory input, which specific DDM parameter must the researcher examine to identify this rapid, error-prone threshold? Take a pause.
And the answer is the decision boundaries, specifically how closely they are set to the starting point.
As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to consider on your own. We discussed how Bayesian inference constructs our reality by combining our internal priors with sensory likelihoods.
Right.
If every single human brain possesses slightly different neurobiology and therefore mathematically weights its priors differently based on its unique history, does an objective, universally shared reality actually exist? Or are we all just walking around trapped inside our own, slightly differing, mathematically constructed posteriors?
A profound question to ponder indeed. Here are the details of this episode.
Computational modeling approaches to psychiatry. Byline. Making the invisible explicit, using models to understand how the mind computes reality.